So I'd like to introduce Dianne Haulcy. She's the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Family Partnership, a high-impact multicultural Minneapolis nonprofit focused on clearing the path to success for individuals and families impacted by low income, systemic racism, and adversity. She is also a Minnesota Public Radio podcast host on Little Moments Count Early Risers podcast, where she discusses how to talk to young children about race and racism. Her podcast is in the third season and has attracted over 40,000 downloads. Dianne is a well-known advocate and leader with 25 years of nonprofit executive experience, most recently as a Senior Vice President of Family Engagement at Think Small. Over her career, she has led 5 early childhood programs, all serving inner-city, low-income, diverse populations. As chair of the Voices and Choices for Children's Coalition, Dianne is instrumental in passing a 2019 law that created the Community Solutions for Healthy Child Development Grant program at the Minnesota Department of Health. These grants fund programs throughout Minnesota so communities of color can improve child development outcomes. We are so thrilled to have Dianne join us today. We've asked her to cover a lot of content in a short amount of time. So we are asking people to add their questions to the chat. Lauren Cotty will monitor the chat and work with Dianne to answer the questions. Please join me in welcoming Dianne.
Thank you, Kathy. I just want to start by saying I'm so happy to be here. Laura and I have been talking about this for quite a while, and it's just a pleasure for me to be able to come and talk with you all, and in particular, because of the work that you all do. I love home visiting. We do quite a bit of home visiting at Family Partnership as well, and I just believe in it. I believe in it immensely in terms of its impact on child development. So I'm really happy to be here today. So if you bear with me, I'm going to just share my screen with my presentation. So thank you for that help. What I've learned a little bit about, I've titled this presentation, Talking to Young Children About Race and Debunking the Myths about Race and Young Children, because one of the things I've learned as I've been hosting the Early Risers podcast is that there's a lot of myths out there about young children and race and how young children develop racial identities and racism. And so today I wanted to just dig in and kind of debunk those myths. And I always like to say that I got started on this journey talking about race because, I've worked in this field of early childhood for many years in human services, many, many years. But I really, when George Floyd was murdered, I really took a good look, not only at my career, but the entire field of early childhood, and really realized that we had our heads in the sand about this whole issue of race and racism, and that we really needed to, that we had not only had our heads in the sand, but we also had an incredible opportunity, because we work with children when they're, from birth and when they're very young, when a lot of this, and we're going to learn today, when at the exact time period where a lot of these racist ideas are forming. So we have an excellent opportunity to fight against that in the field of early childhood. So let's get right into it. How do children develop racism? How do people develop racism? So we're going to talk today a lot about unconscious bias, or what people also call implicit bias. And this bias is any assumption or attitude or stereotype that affects our understanding and actions and the decisions that we make. Now, the reality is we all have them. Everybody has implicit biases. We learn them from when we're very young, and they do develop over time. The key is, though, is to recognize that you do have them. And once you do, then you're able to kind of fight against them. But let's talk about how do these implicit biases, how do they develop? So I have a little video here I'd like to show. It's about schemas, talks a little bit about how our brains develop these biases.
Our brains are extraordinary. Think your smartphone's fast? Turns out your brain is a far more advanced computational machine. We don't notice it, but our brains are constantly and automatically processing millions of stimuli every second. For example, if you see me walking down the street, through casual visual inspection, you instantly sort me into multiple social categories, such as male, middle-aged, and Asian. Once you've tagged me in this way, your brain automatically activates a cloud of information that you've come to associate with each of these categories over the course of your life. All of this happens without any conscious direction, effortlessly, while you're doing other things such as walking your dog, drinking your coffee, dodging cars, and checking your phone. How do our brains perform such complex tasks in real time? We can't possibly attend to each bit of data individually. Instead, we make sense of this fire hose of information by chunking our world through mental schemas. Schemas are templates of knowledge that sort specific examples into broader categories. Think of a chair. When you enter a room and see something with a flat surface, a back, and some legs, you just know it's a chair. And in the instant that you've categorized that thing as a chair, you know how to interact with it. Even if you've never seen this particular chair before, you know exactly what it is and exactly what to do. You sit. Unless something goes wrong, schemas are activated through automatic mental processes, or cognitions that occur outside of our conscious awareness and largely beyond our control. In this sense, they are implicit cognitions. They are also absolutely essential. Without these mental shortcuts, we'd never be able to navigate the world around us, at least not without expending all of our mental resources figuring out where to sit. For this reason, automatic mental processes, such as schemas, should generally be celebrated. It's a neat feature about our brains. Without them, we'd have no chance. But schemas don't apply only to things like chairs, they also apply to people, because in some sense, we're just interestingly complex things. That means automatic processes lead us to sort fellow human beings by schemas, including social categories such as age, role, sex, and race. Here's where things get interesting. We might not care about automatically processing chairs, but automatically processing people? If we want to treat people fairly so that we can all compete in a genuine tournament of merit, might these automatic processes lead us astray? Getting curious? Skeptical?
So I like to watch this video because it really does a nice job of explaining how our brains function and how our brains, how the tools that we use normally to categorize things, how that also lends to us developing implicit bias. And as we know, when children are very young, this is actually a very cool tool, and children are using schemas to categorize things as they learn. They're categorizing, what's different shapes, different colors, different items, and they're building on that. And they are also learning to categorize people. So one of the number one myths that I hear is that children do not see color. And that as it relates to people, which is a very interesting myth because we know in early childhood, colors are one of the first things we teach children. So children do know colors because we are teaching them to them. And so they will talk about the brown chair, they might talk about the blue ball, or maybe it's the orange block. And so all of that is, normal everyday young children conversation. But when we come to saying the brown person, then all of a sudden we tell children, not to mention that. So children do see color. They're noticing color very early. They know their colors, and they are also noticing the colors of people. One of the reasons why people might think that children do not see color very early is because children are also learning from their environments about what they can and cannot say. And so if a child maybe has mentioned the color of a person, it could be that the adults around them either didn't respond to that or told them, oh, we don't talk about that, don't point those things out. And so what children have learned to do then is to not talk about it and to not mention it. But children do see color very early. Dr. Rosemary Allen is one of the guests I had on the podcast, and she's actually also a person, a nationally known early childhood expert that trains a lot about race and implicit bias. And she talks about how children are learning about race as pretty much as soon as they're born. And children studies have shown that children begin to recognize cultural and ethnic differences before they're actually 2 years old. And in fact, there's also studies that show that by the time a child is maybe 6 to 9 months, they're actually also able to recognize if they are being cared for by a person that's a different race of their normal caregiver. They are able to actually notice that by the time they're about 6 to 9 months old. And implicit biases actually begin to seep in by the time the child is 3 to 5 years old. So basically that means by the time a child is actually entering kindergarten, many of their implicit biases have already begun. And I have a quick clip here from Dr. Rosemary Allen.
I asked Dr. Allen to explain how children are not born racist, but instead start to learn about racism in relationship with adults.
What we have to understand is that Black families talk about race very early in a child's life, and it's part of our conversations almost daily. Because it's part of our survival and making sure our children do well, and also to counter racism that they will experience living in America. For white families, their skin serves as a barrier of protection, so they don't have to talk about it so often. But that doesn't mean that children are not aware of race very early. And what we know is that infants are aware of race starting at about 3 months, when they begin to prefer the same race caregiver.
Wow.
And by the time they're 2.5, they begin to categorize people based on race. And when you think about it, Dianne, it's so typical. They're categorizing everything based on how it looks.
They are.
That's how they learn shapes and colors and people and hair and height. So what happens then, as they're categorizing based on skin color, they're picking up adult cues about race. Children know very early in their early childhood classrooms who's preferred, who's not, who gets in trouble, who doesn't, who the teacher likes, what color skin tone. They notice when you go to the supermarket who you ask for help. So many times there can be people of color working at a supermarket. And if a white family is looking for the white person to ask for help, is sending this message to children that the other helpers don't matter. And it happens also in elementary classrooms where 80% of the teacher workforce is white. And the only time children see people of color is serving them. You're my bus driver, you're my cafeteria worker, you're my janitor. So you serve me. And the only people who have authority or who may be equal to me or have authority over me are white people. So do you see how we condition children in terms of race and in terms of who's
Yes.
valued and who's not. And we already know that Black boys, starting at 8 months old, are the most suspended children in America. So white children see Black children as disposable. You get in trouble and you're gone. So they know very early who's valued and who's not.
So, the second myth that I hear a lot about is that children are too young to talk about race. And as we just learned, we know that children are, from a very young age, they are developing, um, they're, they're, they're developing their racial identity, and they're also developing their implicit biases. And so when they're already developing them, if we don't talk to children about race, then all children are really left with is to gather this implicit bias from the environment around them. And then that's how they learn. People believe, though, that children are too young to talk about race because they think that if I talk about race with a young child, it will make them racist. And I've actually heard people say that. There's a fear that we can make young children racist by just mentioning the race of other people or talking about race with young children. The fact of the matter is that there are some, we'll talk about this in a minute, there's actually issues if we don't talk to young children about race. And talking to children about race does not make them racist. We live in a racist environment, and the racism that they're developing is coming from the environment, not from people talking specifically about race. And in fact, I interviewed Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, and I love the way that she talks about, she wrote this book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting in the Cafeteria? And other conversations about race. And she talks about how we live in an environment that is prejudiced. And just like if you were living in a city that had smog in the air, you are going to breathe the smog. You may not want to breathe the smog. You may hate breathing the smog, but if it's in the air, you're going to breathe it. And so we are all living in this smoggy environment of prejudice, and it remains in the air. And that's where it comes from.
Many people say, well, children are colorblind, children are not racist, and so why should we talk to young children about race? And what I try to say is that children are actually developing their cultural and racial identity from the moment they're born, actually. And so can you talk a little bit about how we develop this racial identity? What is happening in our brains developmentally when we're young?
Sure. Let's just start with this idea that children are learning from the time they're born about the world around them. Physical difference is something that children notice and start to comment on as soon as they have language. 2-year-olds can notice that somebody's skin is darker or lighter than theirs and ask about it. They can notice that somebody's hair is curly or straight and want to touch it. Kids do start to learn, even as young as 3 and 4, that there is a hierarchy of racial value, that some people are more valued, some physical appearance is more desirable than other physical appearance. Those values or attitudes are absorbed not because they are innate to us, but because that's what they're learning. They're watching TV. Who gets the star on the television? Who gets to be the star in the book? What toys are being brought into the house and what do those toys look like? The messages about value, human value, and the hierarchy of human value is part of what I call in my book the smog we're all breathing. And that smog is being taken in by not just adults, not just middle schoolers, not just, first graders, but by babies, toddlers, preschoolers. And if you live in a smoggy place, you will become a smog breather, right?
Right.
So if we think about the ways that racism, the messages are embedded in our culture, even if we are silent on the subject, kids are going to absorb that information.
Any
So, so there's a lot in there. And one of the things I like to say is that a lot of times children are, as we say, and as Dr. Tatum said, we're learning these things in our environment. And one of the examples I like to use is that, and they're learning from our implicit biases. So let's say that you are a white person and you have a 2-year-old child, and you decide that you're gonna go to the grocery store, and you pick up your baby and you walk into the grocery store. And as you are going in there, there's an African-American man that's coming out. He may have his child too. You might even greet him and say, a nice hello as you all are passing. But your body might tense up in that exchange. Now, you might not realize that your body is tensing up, but your child that is in your arms will feel it. And they may not even realize cognitively what's happening in that moment. But what that child's body has now learned is that there's some danger here with this particular person that we just crossed. I don't really know why, but my body is absorbing the fact that there is danger here. And so that's how our implicit biases kind of get tossed around, passed on from person to person. And we don't even know. And nobody in that exchange even realizes what is happening. And that's part of what she is saying when she says that if you are living in a smoggy place, you will be a smog breather, whether you want to or not. This is what's happening. So the third myth is, if I teach children not to see color, they will not be racist. So this is the colorblind mentality. I am not going to talk about race. We're not going to point it out at all. And everybody's equal. And so that means that my children will grow up knowing that we're all equal, but we just don't talk about race at all, because it doesn't matter, because we're all equal. We don't see race. We don't see color. So the reality is, of course, we see color. Everybody sees color. And all that does is confuse children, because they know they're picking up things implicitly, but then nobody's talking about anything in their environment. So there's a disconnect. So when we don't talk about race, children are left to learn only through our nonverbal implicit biases, which are lodged in our body language. And they also learn that it is not okay to talk about race. You can imagine, doing this podcast, that sometimes I get, some color commentary that, from people on social media. And I never forget one time I got a comment from a person. He described himself as a white person. They lived in a small town, and he talked about how children do not see race. And I know they don't see race. And he had a young child, maybe 5 or 6. And there was only one Black person that lived in this town. And the reason he stated the reason he knew that children do not see race is because whenever they came in contact with this Black person, their child, treated him, just like everybody else. And he never mentioned the fact that this man was Black. He never asked any questions about it. He never said anything about it. And so he was convinced then that children do not see race. And I remember responding to him, well, basically what your child has learned is that your child cannot talk about race. It's not that your child isn't seeing anything, but they've learned probably through, family and other, people in the environment that it's not okay to talk about it. When children don't talk about race, that's only because they've learned they can't talk about it. It doesn't mean they are not seeing it. They are seeing it. And they continue to see things in the whole environment, especially nowadays. They see things on social media, on TV, on the computer. They hear things from friends and family, all of that. They are seeing it. But when we don't talk about it, they're not able to process it, and they also won't have the language for it. So when we do talk about race, then children do begin to form language to talk about it with their peers. And they learn that they can ask questions. So for instance, if you're in an environment where a white child points out the fact that they're seeing a brown child, then a lot of times, like I said, people will shut that down. Oh, we don't talk about that. We don't want to point out the fact that somebody is different. Well, the reality is there's absolutely nothing wrong with pointing that out. We know everybody sees the fact that this other person may have a darker skin, and there's nothing wrong with that. Yes, that is a brown person, and that's actually an opportunity to have a conversation. Yes, that person's, might come from a different country, and then talk about that country, or maybe their ancestors came from a different country, and then begin to talk about why the fact that their skin is brown. They may come from an area that is much hotter in the region, and it's an opportunity for the child to learn about melanin. And so there's nothing wrong with talking about the fact that somebody else is a different color, or that their hair texture might be different, or that their eyes are shaped different. There's nothing wrong with talking about that in a developmentally appropriate way. That's how children are learning. Remember, they're learning, they're categorizing, including people. So when you talk about it, they learn that it's okay to talk about it, and it's okay to ask questions. And the main reason why adults don't like it when children ask questions about race is because they feel ill-equipped to answer. They feel like either they will say the wrong thing, or that they don't know the answer to it. And I can say, there's lots of things in life we don't have answers for, and it's perfectly okay to tell a child, I don't know. It's better that you say, I don't know, than to shush them, because at least if you say something like, I don't know, but maybe we can learn about it, it keeps the conversation open, and they learn that they can talk about it. And then they'll come back later and ask another question, maybe at another time. So when you're able to talk about it with children, they are able to combat these racist images and have an actual conversation, because it's not an if, but a when that child, as they're growing and developing in our world, at some point in time will come up against something that is derogatory towards another race or another country. And when you've actually had conversations about it with your children, or with that child, they are able to have the language then to combat that. They're able to say even if it's just in their mind, this person is saying this thing, but I know it's not true. If you don't talk about it, when they come up, when they encounter derogatory or racialized incidents or images, then they don't have anything to combat it with. And they might say, all they see is that, and they're like, oh, okay, that's what it is. But if they've already begun to learn how to see it, in a positive way, they're going to combat that, even if it's in their mind. They're going to combat that with language. They're going to combat that with positive images that you all have already talked about and seen. They're going to be able to, develop their own identities around this. So let's talk a little bit about developing these healthy racial identities for children. And so it's important to note that racial identity, cultural development is for everyone. Everyone is developing this, white children included. We heard from our clips already how when we don't talk, when we're raising children in an environment where we're not talking about things and where they're seeing the racism around them and nobody's talking about it, they are developing their they're learning things in all of those situations. And what they're learning is that there is some protection in their white skin in their environment. There's a hierarchy, and that they have some privilege. Now, no, they're not going to know the words for it. They won't be able to articulate it like that, but they will be able to feel it in their body, that their body is more important than others. White privilege affects all children. So, so what we want to be able to teach children, or to teach white children, is that everybody is everybody's body is sacred. Everybody is sacred, including them. But that one person, race, or color is not better than the others. And so we do that, by being able to be in conversation with everyone. A good resource that I've used around this is a book, an old book by Louise Derman Sparks and Patricia Ramsey called "What If All the Kids Are White?" So for children of color, studies show that by the time a child of color is about 7 years old, they have heard or experienced at least one racialized incident. Many have actually experienced it. And by the time a child is in middle school, they have been the subject of several racialized incidents. And once you have compounding racialized incidents or experience them, that's called racialized trauma. And so what's also happening in some of these incidents is that when we don't talk about race, that means that when a racialized incident happens, we're not talking about it. And for that child of color, what happens is they're not able to process it. And so they begin to internalize it. So that child then may begin to believe some of the things that are being said about them. So I always like to say, to combat racialized trauma, it's imperative that children of color in Minnesota have what I like to call good ego strength. They need to have the kind of ego strength about them internally that is strong enough to combat those racist images and those things that people will say about them. They need to know who they are when the world tries to tell them they are somebody else. I have the great pleasure of interviewing our Lieutenant Governor, Peggy Flanagan, and she did a nice job of talking about how she's raising her child and some of the things that her child has already experienced. We're going to listen.
For children of color, exposure to negative racial messages can harm a child's self-esteem and sense of worthiness, even into adulthood. I often say that children of color in particular need to have really strong ego strength so that they can recognize racialized incidents when they happen without internalizing them in a negative way. One of the challenges parents can face is how to respond when racialized incidents happen in the classroom. Peggy Flanagan is Minnesota's 50th Lieutenant Governor. She is a registered member of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe, and she's raising her daughter to be proud and knowledgeable about her Native heritage and to stand up for herself when she encounters microaggressions at school.
We had one incident already, of course, last year where she said, "That's not true." And and which was good, and handled the situation. And we talked to the teacher, and it was all good. But even like this year, she said they were talking about Native Americans and where they live, and someone was like, they live in tents. And apparently, this is like the story that's relayed to me by her teacher. Siobhan sort of rolled her eyes, looked at the teacher, and her teacher said, would you like to talk about this? And she's like, yes. And she said, some Native people lived in teepees. She said, as Ojibwe people, we lived in wigwams. And she's like, but today I live in a house. And it was just like, I don't know that I would have, as an 8-year-old, like felt that confidence, and to also feel like I had a co-conspirator and an ally in my teacher,
Right.
like that's for real. And it is because her teacher has also done that work.
Yes.
Right? That there's that environment, but it's not always going to be that way. And so needing to make sure that she knows who she is, so that in those spaces where she doesn't have a co-conspirator or allyship, that she still can hold her own and, as much as possible, walk out of that situation unscathed.
First of all, I just love that little girl. I love her spirit. And I want to pause here to say a little bit about what we just heard. So what's important to know, and a lot of this, I will say too, I grew up in Minnesota, raised my children here in Minnesota. So I can definitely relate to what Siobhan experienced, both on a personal level and, in raising my own children. And I often, and I've talked to so many parents of color that have experienced, where their children have experienced racialized incidents, to the point to where I tell parents of color, it's not an if, it's a when. When you live in Minnesota, your child of color will at some time or another experience something. And it probably won't just be one time. It'll probably be multiple times by the time they actually graduate. I know my children did, and I did as well. And so, however, what I will say in this example is that rarely do we have somebody like this teacher that actually recognized the fact that something was happening in the moment, was able to give the power back to the child of color, and then actually make it an educational moment for everyone. So the important thing is that her child had the ego strength. She came to class already with a lot of knowing who she is. And like Lieutenant Governor said, I'm not sure I would have had that at 7 or 8 years old. I don't know that I would have had all of that strength. And so every child does not have that. Every child of color does not have that. And when they don't, they do begin to internalize these things. And so that does affect, why we have one of the most abysmal opportunity and achievement gaps here in Minnesota. I firmly believe that is a big reason why, is because children of color are not supported in that way, and that the implicit biases that are happening do affect a child's development once they begin to internalize the racism that is around them. And so this is really important, especially as we are working with families that have young children, because, and I'll say this to you all, it's not an if, but a when you encounter an incident, because there will be, and I don't know all the ins and outs of where you work, but I know Minnesota. And so there will be an opportunity for you to be an ally, or there will be an opportunity for you to speak to what you see happening right in front of you. And when you do that, you're giving the power back to that child of color. And you're also indicating to that child of color what happened was wrong, and don't internalize it. That is extremely powerful for that child. and for that child's family to be able to do that. So, yeah, we already talked about ego strength. So, okay. So let's talk a little bit about racial identity for adults. And I say this because a lot of what happens, as we all know, in early childhood, especially when the child is very young, we're really dealing with what is happening with that adult. What is going on with that adult, and what is that adult communicating then to that child, and how are they interacting with that young child with the information that they have. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done for us adults, and we often say in early childhood, we don't have a child problem, we have an adult problem. And for many of us adults, like I said, we like to be comfortable. And listen, I get it. I love being comfortable. Don't get me wrong. I love it. I'm sitting here now in my flip-flops. I love being comfortable. So I understand the desire to be comfortable. And because of that, though, however, the dangerous part of it is that we don't like to do things that make us uncomfortable. So we don't talk about race a lot of times to children because it makes us uncomfortable. It makes us uncomfortable to talk about it to other adults. So why would we talk about it to our children? I don't know what to say. It makes me uncomfortable. I don't, for a whole lot of reasons, So we just decide not to do it. However, just because we're not talking about something does not mean that it's not affecting us. Resmaa Menakem, who is a New York Times bestselling author of My Grandmother's Hands, and lives in Minnesota, excellent book, by the way, if you haven't read it, talks about how implicit biases are lodged in our bodies. And we need to pay attention to what is happening in our bodies when we are around young children in an effort not to pass on our biases. I actually, years ago, he does some semantic training, and I actually took some training from him years ago, right before the book came out. And I was, and then when the book came out, I called him and I was like, I got to figure out how we can get our early childhood community, this into the hands of early childhood. How can we get this? How can we help our children? And he said, the first thing you need to do is deal with those adults and the adults that are working with children, because we need to do our own work in an effort not to pass on our own biases. So if the question is, so now we know we have implicit biases, what do we do about it? There are many tools, like reading that book, there's many tools in that book that talks about what you do about it. But the basic thing is to listen to your body. Our bodies do tell us a lot if we listen. A lot of times we don't listen, but if we listen, they tell us. And so when we get to a certain thing about, a conversation about race or issue has happened, listen to your body. The next time somebody brings up a racial issue or even just a comment, pause for a second and listen to your body. What's happening in your body? Are you getting nervous? Is there something in your stomach that's going on? Are your eyes fluttering more? Are you feeling some tension in your neck? Listen to your body, because our children do. Our children do listen, and they watch our bodies. And so, like I said before, sometimes we don't realize what we're passing on. But if you tense up around racial incidences, your child, especially your young child, is noticing that, and it's communicating something to them.
So can you talk a little bit about how does racism lie in your body?
Yeah. Racialized trauma for me starts off with a very simple rubric, right? And the rubric is this: the white body deems itself the supreme standard by which all bodies shall be measured, structurally and philosophically. And so Any body that is not housed in a white body is seen as structurally deviant. Before me or you are even born, right? Our mamas and our daddies and our mamas, daddies, mamas, daddy had to try and navigate that structure, right?
Right.
And so in their bodies, navigating that level of stress produces a higher level of cortisol, produces a higher level of epinephrine, produces a higher level of adrenaline, right? So by the time my body and my mama and daddy's sperm and egg get together and start developing my nervous system, I'm in the soup of cortisol. Right?
Soup of
But I don't have an articulation for it, right? But once I get to the planet, what happens is that I start to notice that something is askew, but I don't have a notion for it. And then I start getting older and I don't have a articulation of it, but the notions are roiling around in me. I think something is wrong with me. I think something is wrong with my people. I think something is wrong with my family, right? And we never bring it back to being in a structure that predicates my body as deviant and the white body as standard.
Very powerful. And it's kind of some heavy stuff, but it's true. And so I encourage you to start paying attention to, like, even now, as you're listening to this is, can be considered some heavy stuff. How is your body feeling? Are you tensing up? Are you feeling uncomfortable? Are you feeling anxious for this presentation to be over with? So, just think, pay attention a little bit to how your body is reacting. And it's okay to, like, when you come in contact with these things, take deep breaths, take a moment, especially like when you're in a situation with a young child or perhaps you're with a family and something has happened, something racialized has happened or you've witnessed it. It's okay. And a lot of times we just want to either rush in, we want to do a knee-jerk, rush in or knee-jerk response, or we want to just shut things down. But next time something like that happens, take a moment, even a brief moment, take a deep breath, listen to your body before you respond. And that, it's okay to do that. And realize that you're, where you are, and that you don't necessarily want to operate out of that knee-jerk reaction. Because when you do that, you're operating out of your fear. I don't like this. I don't like talking about this. So let's just move this thing along as quickly as possible so I can get on to something else. But it's okay to just, take a moment, take a breath, and then and then go ahead and respond. So even though we're talking about home visiting today, I'd like to give this example from Sheila Williams Ridge that actually happens in the classroom, mainly because of how she's describing how she was doing a teacher observation and having this conversation, addressing it with a young teacher about something that was happening right in the classroom. And I say this because, as we're doing our work, there may be times when you, if you're a supervisor, for instance, you may have observed one of the people that you supervise may have some implicit biases around something and should be spoken to. But a lot of times it's like, I don't know what to say. Or you may even say, well, I know I got him, so how can I say something about somebody else because I have them? All of the guilt and whatever else is clouding, maybe clouding that. And like I said, yes, just assume we all do have biases, but all that means is that it's all of our responsibility then to try to address them when we see it. it's really important for us as adults to continue to do our own work around these issues. Many reasons why people feel unprepared and don't know what to do in the middle of a racialized incident is because they don't recognize their own bias, and because they're not used to talking about these things, because we don't talk about it, and they're not used to addressing them because we don't address them. And so they feel unprepared. And so I'm just going to play this clip.
And I remember even when I started as the director of the lab school, I had been there for about 5 years as the assistant director. Then I became the director about 6 years ago, doing observations of student teachers in the classroom and doing, observations of new teachers and needing to have conversations with them. So there was a class that I was observing and I was watching their large group activity. And I noticed that, there was a couple of children being disruptive, and the teacher kind of called both of the children and, told them to stop. And I was like, okay. And then it happened a little bit later, and it was the same two children, but the teacher kind of said it in the same way, and then got up and removed the child of color and moved them to a different spot, right? Like after they had been disruptive. And I thought, so that raised a pretty big red flag for me, with that was the person that she chose to move, so I watched another day and I noticed a pattern. And so I pulled the teacher aside and I said, so this is a learning environment. This is what this space is for. I need to tell you that I've noticed a pattern in how you're addressing children. I counted the number of times that you said this child's name during the day. I, counted the number of times that you singled out this child's behavior in large group, even though these behaviors are normative. I need you to just reflect on that for a little while, and then tomorrow we'll meet and sit down and talk about it. Okay. And so having that as a space where we can say, this is a learning environment. I expect you to try things and to make mistakes. And this is not punitive. This is about your growth as a teacher. I believe that you can still be a really amazing teacher if you have all the information. And I bet this is something that you didn't notice. I noticed it. Implicit bias is something that you often don't see. That's why I'm here. I'm here to help. This is why other people are here in this space, to help you grow as a teacher. This feels really bad in the moment. It's going to make you a better teacher.
I really like the way that Sheila approached this, because she addressed it head on. But then she also remains very supportive of this young teacher, but didn't shy away from telling her exactly what she observed, and the fact that she was, she recognized the fact that she probably didn't even recognize, what was happening.
Dianne, this is Laura.
Yeah.
Can I ask
Yes.
you to speak a little bit, kind of bringing these concepts together of how it is important, or why it's important to build one's cultural identity, and that kids are perceiving these experiences around them. Can you speak a little bit about how we as home visitors can help parents and caregivers build ego strength at home, simply by engaging in conversations with families and caregivers about how they want race and culture to show up in their parenting? Can you speak to that a little bit before you move on to the next piece, or at some point?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'll speak to it now. So I want to go back to kind of the conversation a little bit we had about how to support, how do we support young children of color and their ego strength, or, and so there's a lot that we can do. But I think the main thing is to, number one, recognize a person's color and recognize their culture. So, like I said, a lot of times people try to be colorblind. We're all equal. We don't want to show the fact that there's any difference between you and I. Well, there may be a lot of differences. For instance, if you are a white home visitor and your family is a family of color, but you may try to downplay or diminish that. But the reality is everybody sees it. So there's no reason to downplay or diminish it. And there's also nothing wrong with it. There's absolutely nothing wrong. People that, one of the things that is the byproduct of being colorblind is that people of color feel that you have whitewashed who we are. So that means that you're taking away all the stuff that makes the beauty out of who we are by not acknowledging the fact that, not acknowledging my culture. So there's lots that you can do to acknowledge a child's culture and also pull that in to the work that you're doing. Pull someone's culture in. And also, don't shy away from the fact that if you're dealing with a family of color, that not only the parent, but the child may have experienced racialized incidents. So it could be something as you're talking about growing and development that you may come across. A parent may say something like that. And it's important when a parent says something, or even a child, if they're old enough to speak, don't ignore it. Don't gloss over it. Make sure that you address it, or at the very least, listen and speak to it. Ask for, ask how were they supported when that happened? How were you able to support your child when that happened? How would you like to be an advocate for your child? Because sometimes, there's advocacy that needs to happen if a racialized incident has happened. And so the important thing is to be in conversation with your adult about those things that happen. And also, like I said, to celebrate their culture. A lot of times people say we heal within our culture. So there's lots of cultural, whatever culture somebody is, there are lots of things that can come from that culture to help with that child development and celebrate that. The other thing I'll say to that is, because like I said before, all children are developing culturally, and white children as well also are developing, culturally. One of the things that I think could also be challenging for specifically if you are a white home visitor, is that sometimes you may encounter other white people that think because you are white, they can say certain things that are racist to you. And you may not realize when that happens that it's, number one, okay to be offended. And number two, that's a racialized incident too that you may have experienced. And that can be incredibly uncomfortable as well. But also, it's okay to speak to that when that happens. It's okay, it's okay to tell, to use that situation perhaps as a learning opportunity. It also kind of obviously gives you insight into what that child might also be hearing and experiencing, in their own home. And so, it's also an opportunity to kind of, say like how, what and how are you interacting with your child, about race. So the main thing I think is to not, in both instances, is not to ignore it. You may have to step back and like I said, take a couple deep breaths first before you actually engage, which is perfectly fine, but don't ignore it. Pull all of those situations and incidents into the work that you're doing. Because this is a huge, one of the things I want to emphasize is this is, even though we're not going to find it on some domain, in an assessment, cultural and racial development is a huge part of our development, especially in this country, because we are so racially divided. And so, being able to speak to that in your work is incredibly important. And because we don't have because people are so apt to not talk about it, it might make it might make people uncomfortable at first. And it's okay to kind of preface your words when you start out and even say, this might be an uncomfortable conversation, but, and then move on. But I encourage you, and we're going to talk a little bit about this a little bit about this later, but this is not always easy. And you will, it's good to get support from, somebody, as you're doing this work, because it's not always easy to have those conversations. Does that help, Laura?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's just important. I really appreciate the idea of welcoming that conversation early on and asking families how they want this to show up. I really think that's important. And then
Yes.
giving us ideas on how we can manage it when it comes up in our own lives.
Yes. Great. Okay. I have a couple of exercises because this, like I said, this in anything in our lives, it's things get a little easier once you do more and more of it. So I have a couple of exercises we're getting ready to get into. But one of the things I suggest, one of the reasons why, like I said, these conversations are so difficult is because we don't have them and we don't know what to say. And so one of the things I have learned in doing early risers is that I've learned this thing about having prepared responses, or like a treasure chest of responses. So like I encourage you to have to kind of think through different scenarios and think about, how would I respond in this situation? What would I say? And kind of gather some of those together so that you are prepared. These are things that we can be prepared for. We don't always have to be so caught off guard. And so I have a couple of scenarios that we're going to walk through. The first one we're going to do together as a group. And then the second one, I'm going to have you all break off into groups, smaller groups, to ponder it. Okay, so the first one comes from Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, whom we met a little earlier. In her book, chapter 3, The Early Years, she has this story, and she's talking to her son. So I'll read this right quick. Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum's 4-year-old son asked her one day as they were driving home from the grocery store, asked the question, if Africa is so great, what are we doing here? And her response was, a long, long time ago, before there were grocery stores and roads and houses here, the Europeans came and they wanted to build roads and grocery stores and houses, and they knew it would be a lot of work. And they knew they would need a lot of smart, strong workers to cut down trees and build roads and work on farms, and they did not have enough. So they went to Africa to get the strongest, smartest workers they could find. Unfortunately, they did not want to pay them. So they kidnapped them and brought them here as slaves. They made them work and did not pay them, and that was really unfair. So this is a true story that Dr. Tatum talks about in her book. And if you've read the book, then you already know what happened. But this is often a very difficult question to answer. It's hard to talk about slavery to young children. And so this is one of the situations where you may want to gather some information beforehand and have kind of an answer already prepared. And it's a topic where a lot of times when it's brought up, this is one of those topics that gets shut down because it's so difficult to talk about. But young children may hear about it and they may ask about it. This question was asked by Dr. Tatum's son when he was just 4. So the question is, and I'm going to give you a couple minutes before I ask for answers to think about this, but the question is, how would you continue to tell this story in a way that, number one, does not frighten the 4-year-old, and number two, does not describe the Africans as passive victims, and number three, does not paint all white people as bad? Very difficult task. And these are all a lot of the reasons why people avoid having this conversation with young children, or at all, quite frankly, because they don't want to frighten children, and they don't want to paint African Americans as passive, and they don't want children to make it sound like all white people are bad or to be afraid of white people. I felt like she did a really lovely job in answering this, but I'm not going to tell you the answer yet. I'm going to give you a couple minutes, and then I'm going to ask for your input. Like, how would you continue this story? So let's see. Let's take 3 minutes. Okay. Tell me if you can hear this.
And that was really unfair.
Now we can.
Even as I told this story, I was aware of 3 things. 1, I didn't want to frighten this 4-year-old, who might worry that these things would happen to him, another characteristic of 4-year-old thinking. 2, I wanted him to know that his African ancestors were not just passive victims, but had found ways to resist their victimization. And 3, I did not want him to think that all white people were bad. It is possible to have white allies. So I continued. Now, this was a long, long time ago. You were never a slave. I was never a slave. Grandmommy and Granddaddy were never slaves. This was really a long time ago. And the Africans who were kidnapped did whatever they could to escape. But sometimes the Europeans had guns, and the Africans didn't, so it was hard to get away. But some even jumped off the boats into the ocean to try to escape. There were slave rebellions, and many of the Africans were able to escape to freedom after they got here, and worked to help other slaves get free. Now, even though some white people were kidnapping Africans and making them work without pay, other white people thought that this was very unfair, which it was. And those white people worked along with the black people to bring an end to slavery. So now it is against the law to have slaves. Jonathan was paying very close attention.
So I'll stop it there. But I just thought that she just did a really nice job of kind of tying the whole conversation together in a way that was really good. So we're going to go on to our next. Our next, where are we? Here we are. Okay, are you seeing this again?
Yes.
But not the right one?
It's on Beverly. There you go. Now you're on the next one.
Okay. This next one, we're going to break up into groups about, but I'm going to read it first, and then you all will take some time in your small groups. So this is about Thanksgiving. One of the people that I interviewed was Vanessa Goodthunder. She's the director of the Lower Sioux Head Start program in Minnesota, and she is Dakota and Navajo. And she says, I remember growing up with Thanksgiving. I just got really quiet, and I did not say anything, and I wanted to disappear when I always saw Columbus, and I always saw Thanksgiving, the depiction of the Native Americans, certain tribes, in their outfits back then, because nobody acknowledged that is not what we look like. So what she's describing, I can definitely relate to, because when I was younger and Thanksgiving time rolled around, I always remember, plus, I'm a woman of a certain age, but still, I remember these pictures that we would see of Native Americans in traditional dress. Oftentimes there was a teepee maybe somewhere around. And so this is how they were just depicted alongside the Pilgrims. And nobody ever questioned it. Nobody ever said anything about it. And so because of that, those biases, we grew up with them. We grew up with these images. Nobody combated those images. But hearing Vanessa talk about this, imagine her, Dakota and Navajo, sitting in a classroom, seeing those same pictures and those same images. And so this is what she talks about, how she got really quiet, and she wanted to disappear. And so that's huge, because remember when I was talking about, oftentimes these things, for children of color, they begin to internalize them. So the question is, how do you talk about Thanksgiving with your families, when you're working with your families? How can you talk about what really happened in a way that upholds Indigenous culture and is truthful? So I think we're going to break into groups. I'm going to pause and let Kati give us some direction about that. So we only have a few more minutes left. And with that, I want to give a little bit of encouragement. Let's see here. Can you all see this? Okay. So like I said, this work is difficult, and it can be hard, but it's not really a solo kind of thing. When I mean this work, I mean when you start to realize that you want to deal with your own implicit bias, and to also figure out ways of how to bring that into the work that you're doing, it's not easy. But so here's a few things that I like to encourage people to put in your toolkit around this. It's really good to have a journey mentality about this. And I say this because people often get shut down when they are not able to immediately answer everything and say all the right things. First of all, put that out of your mind. You are going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. You're going to say things that you wish you hadn't said. That's just part of it. But, coming to terms with this and, being anti-racist, trying to deal with your own implicit bias, it's a journey. We are all on this journey together. So it's not really a destination, but it's long-term. And it's good to have a curiousness about it. And so, to be more curious than to be judgmental on yourself. Like a lot of times we judge ourselves and say, oh, I don't know how to do that, and I can't do that, or I didn't do that right. When you make mistakes, just look at that as a learning opportunity, and just continue to be curious about it. The other thing, and I really encourage you, and it's great that you all have this, this group here with this coalition. It's good to find at least one safe person, at least one, to discuss your fears and mistakes, so that when something happens, you have somebody else that you can process it with. And I'll also say that if it can't be a family member, it's okay. It might be a family member, but it's okay if it's not. It could really be anybody. It could be a friend at work. It could be a member of the coalition. Anybody. The only thing that is important about this other person, though, is that they have to be completely non-judgmental. Because when you make mistakes, you don't want to be in a situation where you're being judged by it, and vice versa. You can be non-judgmental to them as well. So this person, you have to be completely free and able to, and honest, and be able to be completely free and honest with this person, and telling them things and being able to process it. The other thing is, like I said, there's always times when mistakes happen, or like Susan was talking about, sometimes we learn information and realize that I was thinking one way, and the way I was thinking was wrong. And now I'm realizing what the truth really is. It's always okay to go back and do repair. Sometimes in this journey, you will miss the mark, but it's always okay to go back. And this can be even with children. It could be with your families. Perhaps you are at a home visit and something happens, and you weren't prepared in that moment with the right response. It's okay to come back the next time and say, hey, I want to say last time this happened and I didn't respond how I really wanted to. And this is what I would have really liked to say. And it's always okay to do that. You know, it doesn't have to, if something bad, you know, doesn't go the right way, it doesn't have to end there. It doesn't have to be the end of the story.